Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something that's, well, it's a law of history that is as profound as it is, frankly, terrifying.
It is.
We're going on this extraordinary journey, really, that connects a medieval city in 1492 to a Supreme Court ruling in, what, 2017?
Exactly. It sounds like they have nothing to do with each other, but there's a common thread, and it's constitutional failure.
Right.
We're really asking a question that I think every modern leader should be thinking about. What is the universal mechanism of collapse that links the surrender of Granada to a high-stakes court case in modern Pakistan?
And we're diving into this idea that civilizations, well, they rarely fall just because of an enemy at the gates.
No, not at all.
They collapse because of internal sabotage.
Right.
And the culprit, the one thing that connects all these moments, is something we're calling constitutional fragmentation.
And our mission today is to pull out this universal recurring pattern. We're working from some excellent sources shared by a listener, all researched by Mr. Zaheer Ahmad Meer.
And these sources cover everything. I mean, the Islamic Caliphate, the Byzantine Empire, and some really deep modern constitutional law.
They do.
So we're looking for that precise moment, the tipping point where leaders fighting each other becomes more destructive than any foreign army.
That's it. That's the real marker of decline. It forces you to redefine what national strength even is. It's not about the army.
It's about the integrity of the institutions.
Precisely. Strength is institutional loyalty. So let's unpack the history that really proves this rule.
Okay, so to really feel the tragedy of 1492, we have to start at the top, at the peak.
We have to.
We begin in Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, a civilization that flourished for almost 800 years. This wasn't just a kingdom, it was, for a time, the global center of excellence.
And it's so important to stress the brilliance here because the contrast with the collapse is what makes this law fragmentation so vivid. Al-Andalus wasn't just wealthy, it was, structurally sophisticated.
Okay, so let's list some of those areas where they just excelled. I mean, everyone thinks the architecture, right? The Alhambra, the Great Mosque of Cordoba.
Of course.
But that was just a symptom, wasn't it? A symptom of a really healthy constitutional body.
Absolutely. The real strength was in their systems. You look at science and mathematics, where they didn't just preserve classical knowledge, they advanced it.
Right.
Then there's philosophy, and this is key, a deep religious tolerance. It was the dhimmi system, which allowed Jews, Christians, and Muslims to coexist. And not just coexist, but contribute and thrive under a predictable legal framework.
And that idea, that level of tolerance for centuries, that's a stunning constitutional achievement. It's not just about goodwill.
No.
It requires a robust, really sophisticated judicial system to manage all those competing interests.
Precisely. We're talking about courts that handled complex commercial law, land disputes, minority rights, all operating under institutions that lasted for a very long time.
So you have these model cities, Cordoba, Seville, Granada.
Model cities is the right term. They were intellectual hubs that they completely outstripped their Christian counterparts for centuries. Cordoba, at its peak, had public streetlights, libraries with hundreds of thousands of books.
And all of that was achieved because there was a central political structure, the Caliphate of Cordoba, that for a long time kept order and pooled the resources.
It is effective.
So if they were so brilliant, so advanced, how did it all fall apart? The sources are really clear on this. It wasn't a lack of science or art.
Yeah.
It failed because that underlying system of pooled resources and shared loyalty, that constitutional unity, it just shattered.
And this is where we have to get into the political mechanics.
Yeah.
The central failure, the thing that started it all, was the fracturing of the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba.
Right.
In the early 11th century, it just broke down. It splintered into dozens of small, localized, and often very hostile little kingdoms. They were called the Taifas states.
The Taifas. The word itself means faction or party, right?
Yeah.
That just sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It is.
How does a unified system just splinter like that?
It's a systemic failure of governance. Specifically centralization. The caliphate's authority depended on two things: centralized taxes and control over the military.
Okay.
But when the central authority got weak, mostly due to fights over succession, a classic constitutional problem, these local governors and military strongmen just stopped sending tax money to Cordoba.
So the money dried up first.
Yeah.
And if the caliph can't get tax revenue, he can't pay his central army.
Exactly. Which means the local strongmen who have their own little militias can just seize power. And that's what the Taifas states were, this radical decentralization. Each one had its own little king, its own militia,
And they were all competing with each other.
competing for the same limited resources, the same territory. It is the ultimate example of regionalism turning into, well, self-destruction.
And it got truly self-destructive. It wasn't just competition. Instead of seeing themselves as part of one culture with one shared enemy at the border.
They saw their Muslim neighbor as the main threat.
That's the critical detail, isn't it?
It's astonishing. The sources show that these Taifa rulers would actively form alliances with the Christian kingdoms, with Castile and Aragon, just to get a temporary leg up on a fellow Muslim ruler next door.
They weren't just making alliances, they were paying them.
They were literally paying tribute. It was called the pariahs.
Paying protection money to your own enemy. That is just, it's constitutional malpractice on a cosmic scale.
Yeah.
They were subsidizing the armies of the Reconquista.
Yes. Strengthening the external enemy with their own money, all because of their internal squabbles. All because they valued their little local factional power more than their collective survival.
So the final conquest by Ferdinand and Isabella, it wasn't really an invasion.
It was an inevitability. The disunity made it so.
To see the human cost of this, we have to look at the very end, the last holdout,
Granada.
and the tragic figure of its last ruler, Abu Abdullah, or Boabdil, as he was known.
And his reign, it wasn't just unlucky. It was structurally doomed from the start by all these internal conflicts that were inherited from that Taifa collapse.
When you personalize it like that, the tragedy is just, it's palpable. We sometimes see Boabdil as this last romantic hero, but his biggest fights weren't with the Christians outside the walls.
That's the supreme irony of it. The sources detail the pressures he was under, and they are overwhelmingly internal.
It's unbelievable.
He was caught in a brutal civil war with his own family. He was fighting his own father, Abu Hassan Ali, and his uncle, who was very popular, Muhammad XIII, known as El-Zagal.
A three-way civil war for control of the very last Muslim kingdom in Spain.
Yes.
While Ferdinand and Isabella are just watching from across the border, consolidating their huge, brand new United Kingdom, the level of self-sabotage there is just hard to get your head around.
And it gets even worse. At one point, Boabdil was captured by Ferdinand,
Right.
and he was released in 1483 on one condition, that he go back and continue fighting his internal rivals, which would keep Granada perpetually weak and destabilized.
So betrayal wasn't just a risk. It was an active foreign policy tool that was being used against them.
And it worked, because the state was already fractured. So when the Christian armies finally laid siege to the city of Granada, Boabdil couldn't coordinate a defense. He couldn't trust his own generals, his own court. He couldn't even trust his family.
The constitutional loyalty, the basic trust in the system was just gone.
It had completely evaporated.
So that famous moment, the surrender of the keys to Ferdinand and Isabella in January 1492, it was just the official execution of a civilization that had already committed suicide decades before.
That's it, exactly. The lesson from Granada is so clear. Constitutional failure is this combination of things: political disunity, fragmentation of leadership, the weakening of your judicial and administrative bodies.
And crucially, a loss of moral unity, a loss that lets leaders put their personal grudges ahead of the survival of the state.
Which brings us to the core principle we're trying to extract today. The one sentence that really sums up Granada's fate.
No civilization survives when leaders fight each other more than they defend their people.
It's a law of governance. It really is. It's not about the strength of your sword. It's about the strength of your system.
When the elites in charge weaponize that system against each other, the state becomes its own worst enemy.
And all high culture, the art, the sophisticated law, it all becomes irrelevant once that constitutional loyalty is gone.
Okay, so we have to prove this isn't just a one-off, not just a tragedy specific to Iberia.
Right.
To show this is a universal law of fragmentation, we've got to go across the Mediterranean to the fall of Constantinople in 1453, just 40 years before Granada.
It's the perfect parallel. If Granada shows us how regional kings can destroy unity, Constantinople is this terrifying mirror image of how institutional elites, your generals, your clergy, your noble families, can do the exact same thing.
And this was the end of the Byzantine Empire, the longest surviving constitutional system in Europe.
It was.
We have to remember, by 1453, the empire was already, a shadow of what it once was.
A very small shadow, yes.
But the sources really emphasize that the internal decay was the most immediate threat, long before Sultan Ahmad II showed up with his giant cannon.
The city was suffering from a deep deep institutional exhaustion. And the symptoms of this rot are remarkably similar to what happened in Al-Andalus.
So you have provinces rebelling, not just because of some external pressure, but because the central government had lost control, lost trust, usually because of corruption and erratic taxes.
And crucially, you have toxic court politics, rivalries among the emperors themselves. And this wasn't just petty squabbling. This was open, devastating civil war.
Which is the direct parallel to the Taifa states, isn't it?
It is the vital comparison. From the 14th century on, the ruling dynasty, the Paleologos dynasty, was just consumed by these brutal civil wars. You have all these emperors named John and Andronikos fighting each other for the throne.
And they would hire foreign mercenaries to do it.
Serbs, and terrifyingly, even Ottoman forces. They would pay them with land, with gold, with military access into their own territory.
Wait. So just like the Taifa states were paying the Christian kings, the Byzantines were paying the Ottomans to help them fight their internal rivals.
It is the exact same mechanism of self-destruction. There's a famous example, John VI Constantinople. He paid Ottoman forces to help him secure the throne against a rival.
So all the state's resources are being diverted to finance the current civil war.
Which means the one institution you absolutely need to defend the city, the military, is critically underfunded and scattered all over the place.
And on top of that, you have this deep division between the church and the state. These intense theological fights over whether to reconcile with the Catholic West.
The Union of Florence, yes. That fractured their moral unity. It made it impossible to get military aid from Europe because a huge part of the population actually saw the Western Catholics as a bigger threat than the Ottomans.
So by the time Mehmed II actually lays siege to the city,
the constitutional structure had already self-immolated. The external attack was just the consequence, not the cause, of that institutional exhaustion.
Okay, so let's draw the explicit parallels now, because when you lay them side by side, the pattern is just undeniable.
It's chilling, really.
First, you have both civilizations enjoying these centuries of brilliance.
And then an institutional implosion that's driven by decades of internal political fighting. This isn't a slow, graceful decline. It's a rapid, self-inflicted constitutional breakdown.
Second, the intense rivalry among the elites. In Al-Andalus, it's the regional Taifa kings and Boabdil's own fractured family.
And in Byzantium, it's the powerful noble families, the generals, and the theological factions, all fighting for control of what's left of the state.
Third, they both suffer these catastrophic financial crises.
Because, as we said, they're wasting all their money fighting each other, or worse, paying it as tribute to the external enemy.
Right. When leaders are focused only on their own factional survival, the state's treasury it collapses.
It's inevitable.
And I think most tragically in both cases, you have this profound disunity in the actual defense of the realm. They couldn't pool resources, couldn't coordinate strategy.
And they completely failed to adapt to the changing world around them, all because their internal hatred was stronger than their external fear.
This leads us back to that analytical conclusion from the sources, the one that links this fragmentation to the idea of justice.
Yes. The statement is, brilliance without unity is temporary. That covers all the art and the science. But the deeper insight is this. Unity without justice is impossible.
Let's really unpack that. How did a lack of justice in these places directly prevent unity?
It all comes down to trust.
Okay.
In both the Taifa states and late Byzantium, the fragmentation wasn't just leaders being petty. It was rooted in the perception and often the reality that the central authority was corrupt or unfair, or that it was prioritizing one faction over another.
So when the system of justice itself fails,
Right.
when taxes are unfair, when political jobs are given out based on loyalty instead of merit, when succession is decided by a civil war instead of by law,
then the local elites and the people, they lose faith in the constitutional center. It's just that simple.
So if you're a local governor in Al-Andalus and you see the caliphate is corrupt, you have no moral reason to keep sending them your tax money.
You keep it for yourself. You build your own little kingdom, a Taifa state.
And if you're a general in Constantinople and you think the emperor is rewarding your rivals unfairly,
you're incentivized to launch a civil war, which means, hiring Ottomans to help you.
So that breakdown of fairness, of justice, that's the corrosive acid that eats away at a unified state.
It turns it into just a collection of self-interested factions. Injustice breeds distrust, distrust breeds rivalry, rivalry destroys unity, and a lack of unity invites collapse.
That's the universal law we're seeing.
That's the law.
Okay, the big takeaway here is that constitutional integrity, it's not some historical artifact. It's an evergreen necessity.
Always.
So now we have to jump to the modern era, to 2017, right? See how these same mechanisms of fragmentation can play out in a 21st century state.
Specifically, during the constitutional storm in Pakistan after the Supreme Court disqualified Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif in the Panama Papers case.
The setting changes from a besieged city wall to a high courtroom, but the stakes are, identical. The health of the constitutional structure.
And the battle between competing centers of power within that state?
The Panama Papers, that was a global data leak.
Yeah.
But in Pakistan, it became the one single event that triggered this massive constitutional crisis.
And the legal mechanism they use for the disqualification is so crucial here because it speaks directly to that moral dimension of fragmentation we were just talking about.
Right. The Supreme Court used Article 62 of the Constitution,
which requires a member of parliament to be Sadiq and Amin.
Which translates to truthful and trustworthy.
Yes. And that requirement is highly unusual in most modern democracies. It's rooted in moral and religious standards, not strictly legal or financial ones.
And that just immediately raises the constitutional temperature, doesn't it? You're not just dealing with a normal corruption charge anymore.
Yeah.
You're dealing with a legal mandate based on, subjective moral character.
Exactly. And what makes Article 62 so controversial is that it had been dormant for decades. It was originally put into the Constitution during a period of martial law under General Zia-ul-Haq.
Okay.
So for the Supreme Court to use it in 2017, well, it was seen by many as a highly activist judicial intervention. The judiciary was effectively making itself the moral arbiter of who was fit to be in politics.
And this wasn't a simple court case. It required this huge, unprecedented investigation. The Joint Investigation Team, the JIT, that became the center of the whole political battle.
And that JIT needs some context. It wasn't just a standard police committee.
Right.
The JIT was made up of people from a huge range of agencies. You had the Securities and Exchange Commission, the State Bank, the National Accountability Bureau.
And critically, members from military intelligence agencies, the ISI and military intelligence. So the inclusion of military intelligence of all these other non-judicial bodies, it institutionalized the conflict.
It did.
It wasn't just a court case. It was the executive branch being investigated and judged by a panel that included elements many people would see as part of the deep state. The fragmentation was now formally mapped right onto the institutions of the state itself.
And when we compare this 2017 crisis to our historical collapses, you see these clear modern symptoms of the exact same institutional stress.
What's the direct parallel to the Taifa states fighting each other?
Political hyperpolarization, a complete weakening of the parliamentary spirit. Political parties, instead of, engaging in governance and compromise,
They entered this zero-sum political war. The goal wasn't to win an election, it was to completely annihilate or remove the opposition.
that's the modern democratic equivalent of the Taifa states refusing to cooperate.
And that kind of rivalry, it naturally leads to an erosion of public trust in the whole system.
Of course.
When institutions are so visibly being used as weapons against political opponents, the public loses faith. Just like people lost faith in the corrupt Byzantine court or the Caliph court in Cordoba.
And we have to emphasize the core constitutional tension here. The active debate between judicial activism versus judicial restraint.
That's the fracture line.
That's the fracture line. The Supreme Court, by using Article 62(1)(f), was accused by some of overstepping its traditional constitutional role, of effectively entering the political arena.
So you have one center of power, the judiciary, actively destabilizing another, the executive.
Which is the ultimate sign of constitutional fragmentation, isn't it? When the institutions that are supposed to balance power start attacking each other, the state becomes divided against itself.
And just like the Reconquista and the Ottomans, exploited the weaknesses that were already there.
The modern dynamic is the same. A global leak, like the Panama Papers, acts as the external catalyst. It exploits the lack of transparency, the existing political divisions, to dictate domestic political outcomes.
An information leak becomes as destabilizing as an invading army.
Because the internal political landscape was already primed for self-destruction.
Let's pull this all together then. The constitutional risks are just. They're evergreen. In the 15th century, fragmentation meant the physical fracturing of territory and armies.
And in the 21st century, it means the functional fracturing of institutional integrity and political legitimacy.
The pattern holds up perfectly. Internal political rivalries, the endless hostility between the ruling party and the opposition, it completely overshadowed any sense of national unity, any legislative agenda.
They fought each other more than they protected constitutional stability. It's the same story.
The leaders used the courts, the investigative agencies, the media. They all became battlegrounds. The institutions themselves became the modern Taifa states, competing centers of power, each trying to assert its sovereignty over the others.
And the warning here is so important. While Pakistan didn't physically fall like Granada or Constantinople, the crisis is a profound warning.
The mechanism of self-destruction is constant.
It is. A modern nation divided against itself, its institutions at war with each other, is fundamentally unstable. It's just inviting the next political or economic crisis. And the stakes, given Pakistan's place in the world, are no less existential than they were for Byzantium.
This has been an incredibly rigorous analysis. I mean, we've covered 500 years. We now have these three distinct cases of constitutional stress.
The Umayyad Caliphate's collapse, the end of the Byzantine Empire, and this modern crisis in Pakistan.
So now it's time to bring them all together, to synthesize that single universal law they all seem to confirm.
And this side-by-side comparison really solidifies the idea that these mechanisms of breakdown, they transcend culture, they transcend political systems, they transcend time itself.
Constitutional unity is the prerequisite for survival.
It is. So let's review this systematically using the factors we've identified in the sources.
Okay, let's start with internal division.
In Granada, 1492, it was the physical fragmentation, the Taifa states, driven by local strongmen, and the collapse of the central tax system.
Right.
In Constantinople, 1453, the division was institutional rivalry. Those powerful elite families, the clergy, the generals, and those brutal, repeated civil wars.
And in the Panama Verdict, 2017.
The division was political hyperpolarization. It drove a wedge between the executive, the judiciary, and that whole investigative apparatus of the JIT.
Okay, next category, the mechanism of failure. In 1492, it was that internal rivalry destroying unity, leading to Taifa rulers literally hiring Christian forces. It's direct self-sabotage.
In 1453, it was the rivalry within the Palaiologos family and the clergy, often using Ottoman forces or selling off imperial assets just for a temporary political win.
And in 2017, a mechanism was rivalry between the institutions, specifically the judiciary asserting this potent, very controversial moral check on the executive.
Turning the constitutional balance of power into a zero-sum battleground.
Next up, the institutional state itself. What did it look like?
In Granada, you had a completely collapsing administrative order, no centralized defense, and just rampant local corruption.
In Constantinople.
Chronic financial insolvency. A constitution that was too weak to stop the emperor's rivals from selling off territory to win their civil wars.
And in 2017, the state was defined by that high tension between the judiciary and the executive. That whole debate over judicial activism and applying a subjective moral clause to remove a sitting prime minister. And what about the role of external exploitation? The external force always seems to exploit the internal fracture.
Always. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella actively fostered and financed the divisions among the Taifa rulers and within Boabdil's own family.
And in 1453, Sultan Mehmed II basically just had to wait for the Byzantines to exhaust themselves through civil war and doctrinal fights before he delivered the final blow.
And in the modern context of 2017, the dynamic is more subtle, but it's similar. Global financial leaks, the Panama Papers, provided the information lever.
It exploited the existing lack of transparency and the political divisions.
And it gave the institutional rivals, like the courts and the JIT, the ammunition they needed to act. The external force leverages the internal weakness to achieve this transformative political effect.
Finally, the result. Granada meant the end of an 800-year golden era.
A unique civilization gone.
Constantinople meant the end of the longest-running empire in Europe.
And the 2017 crisis, while not a physical collapse, it marked the beginning of a profound new constitutional era in that country, one defined by acute institutional tension, reshaped power dynamics, and this new emphasis on moral accountability enforced by the courts.
So having reviewed all three of these cases, we can now state that fundamental unifying principle, the ratio decidendi.
The binding reason, yes. The core insight we have to take away from all this.
And that universal collapse principle, proven by all this history, is no nation collapses solely due to external pressure. It collapses when internal division destroys constitutional unity.
It's a powerful reorientation of how we think about national security. It states so clearly that failure is an internal choice.
Right. A strong, unified, and just constitutional system can weather almost any storm. The Ottomans, the Reconquista, global financial leaks.
But once the elites prioritize their own factional survival over the integrity of the state itself, the system becomes defenseless.
It also gives agency back to the leaders, doesn't it? It suggests their highest duty isn't just winning the next election or beating their rival.
Their highest duty is actively maintaining the health and the unity of the shared constitutional framework.
And when political competition breaks that boundary of shared loyalty, it becomes, in a way, treason to the state, no matter what era you're in.
And we should just reflect for a moment on the magnitude of these breakdowns. The memory of the loss has to reinforce the severity of this constitutional law.
The fall of Granada. It wasn't just a political defeat. It was the vanishing of a civilization known for its science, its tolerance, its genius, a trauma caused by political self-interest at the very top.
And the fall of Constantinople fundamentally reshaped the world. It showed that institutional longevity is meaningless against internal rot. 1,000 years of history couldn't save them from the poison of factional civil war.
And the Pakistan crisis, while not a military collapse, it permanently altered the relationship between the major pillars of the state, the judiciary, the executive, the regulatory bodies. It showed that this universal law of fragmentation is still dangerously active in modern governance.
So the moral conclusion is just unavoidable.
Division is more destructive than any foreign enemy.
Unity is the prerequisite for civilization, and justice is the only pathway to achieving and protecting that unity. When justice fails, rivalry emerges, and rivalry ensures collapse.
This has been a sobering, but I think a deeply necessary deep dive. We have traced this powerful universal law of constitutional fragmentation from the Taifa states of 1492 through the civil wars of Constantinople and right into the high states courtrooms of 2017.
The enemy is almost always within, and the structural integrity of the state is the ultimate vulnerability.
And we've established these two core, non-negotiable principles from Mr. Zaheer Ahmad Meer's research. Constitutional unity is essential for survival.
And the prerequisite for that unity is justice within the political system.
So we saw judicial review, like in the Panama Verdict, acting as a reactive measure, a kind of surgical strike against fragmentation. But if the profound lesson here is that leaders must defend the Constitution rather than fight each other, what constitutional mechanisms beyond this kind of responsive judicial action might a modern state build to proactively ensure moral and institutional unity before that Taifa mentality sets in?
It forces you to think about constitutional design for prevention, not just for cure. How do you create institutional disincentives for self-serving rivalry? Maybe mandatory bipartisan cooperation on key national security or fiscal issues? I don't know.
Because the history as Al-Andalus and Byzantium warns us that waiting for the crisis to hit is already too late.
Far too late.
A compelling and challenging thought for you to carry forward. Our sources for this deep dive, tracing this powerful universal law of constitutional fragmentation, were researched and authored by Mr. Zaheer Ahmad Meer.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.
We'll see you next time.